Hello, thank you so much for your time and interest today. My name is Jim Blando, and I'm an associate professor at Old Dominion University, located in Norfolk, Virginia. Today, I'm going to talk about a general overview of the exposure assessment process, but I'm going to talk about specific approaches that are utilized in the United States EPA exposure assessment methodologies. One of the three general overall approaches that EPA describes in many of their procedures is something oftentimes referred to as point of contact approaches, which essentially is taking measurements out in the field. That's essentially what this process is. And we want to talk today a little bit about some of the specific details about how the United States Environmental Protection Agency utilizes this approach to conduct exposure assessments. So, as already mentioned, point of contact approaches are essentially getting out in the field and taking measurements. It's important to note that when we take measurements, we're oftentimes doing some type of monitoring. Keep in mind that it's important to utilize validated methods. That is something that is key because, as we all know, when we take environmental measurements, not only do we have the potential for artifacts to occur when we do our sampling, we can also have artifacts occur when we actually analyze those samples in a lab. When we utilize validated measurement technologies, oftentimes those types of parameters have been evaluated. Validated methods oftentimes will have their precision and accuracy delineated, evaluated, interferences. Sometimes we can take samples, and depending on what chemicals are present, you may find that some chemicals can interfere with the measurement of other chemicals that may be in the sample. All of this has been evaluated when we utilize validated measurements, and it's important for us to know what those evaluations showed in terms of accuracy, precision, and interferences. So that's key for us to think about when we actually go out to take exposure measurements. There's also something called data quality objectives that is stipulated by EPA when we utilize exposure assessment plans using point of contact approaches. The data quality objectives essentially detail all the specifics about the sampling methods and approaches that you're going to use. This may include how you're going to handle the samples. This may include the utilization of blank samples to help us understand what the detection limits may be. This may incorporate some discussion of the expected precision that one would expect in their measurements. If I take multiple samples, how representative would they be of the given scenario that I'm evaluating? So the data quality objectives are essentially the quality control procedures as well as the quality control objectives that one wants to reach when they utilize these point of contact measurement approaches. The more precision that is required, oftentimes that will result in an increase in the expense of conducting those measurements. So it's not uncommon, depending on the purpose and the objectives of your exposure assessment, it's not uncommon to utilize that purpose and objectives to define what accuracy and precision you need so that you can conserve your resources and provide the accuracy and precision that is needed. If you provide samples that have a lower accuracy and precision than what is needed, they won't be usable. However, if you provide samples that have a higher accuracy and precision than what is needed, they will tend to be more expensive. So finding the right balance is oftentimes important because exposure assessments can be very resource intensive and we have to be aware of our budgets and our limitations. So sampling strategies. It's important for us to think about how important it is for us to strategize and carefully consider how we're going to do our sampling and where we are going to sample. So many factors can play a role, but sampling strategies can be as varied as your imagination. They certainly should be tailored to fit the objectives, needs, and purpose of your exposure assessment. They, of course, need to be based on good logic and sound science, but they might be also influenced by other factors as well. For example, when we did the Toms River Pediatric Cancer Study, the community had specific concerns about some specific sources of pollution. So it became important for us to think about providing the community with the answers that they were seeking, which included the inclusion of certain sources of pollution that we evaluated so that we could provide those answers to the community. So there can be other factors that can influence your sampling strategy as well. But it's important for us to keep in mind that the primary driver is going to be the purpose and objectives of your exposure assessment. Of course, sampling analysis are crucial to the characterization and evaluation of the exposures. And also, we can sometimes, and I personally like to see this, if we are actually conducting computer modeling, I always like to see some samples collected if possible to just validate that the model is producing reasonable results. I think that can be very helpful as well. So when we think about sampling strategies and our sampling plan, it's important for us to keep in mind that this should be something that's well documented, but in particular also documents the important data quality objectives. One of the key parameters one must ask themselves when they're developing their sampling plan is you have to ask yourself, why am I doing the sampling? What is the purpose of my sampling? There are some listed here on the slide that could drive your purpose and objectives, and this includes, are you doing the sampling for compliance purposes? Are you doing the sampling for a research project? Are you doing it for public health protection? Are you doing this to demonstrate attainment status with government regulations? The purpose of why you're doing the sampling is going to drive a lot of your objectives. For example, if you're doing something for compliance purposes or to comply with a given regulation, it's very likely that the sampling approach and sampling plan and where you're going to sample is going to be delineated in the regulation. And if the purpose of your sampling is to demonstrate compliance, then you have to follow what the regulations are telling you to do. So this is going to drive the goals and objectives of your sampling plan. Of course, your resources, sampling can be very expensive, so the resources and budget you have may also influence your sampling plan as well. And of course, this is all going to be expressed as well in terms of your data quality objectives, which I've already described and will describe in the next slide. So data quality objectives, here's a statement by EPA, but essentially this is our quality control, quality assurance procedures, which directly influence the uncertainty in the measurements that we take. Defined very broadly, you could ask yourself the question, what do I need to meet the objectives of the exposure assessment in terms of the minimum number of samples that I need, what parameters I'm going to measure, how I'm going to analyze the samples, how I'm going to analyze the data that comes from the analytic chemistry of my samples, and so on. So the data quality objectives by EPA guidelines have to be very explicitly documented and described in your sampling plan. So there are a couple other parameters that we need to think about when we think about environmental sampling. One of the things that we have to think about is knowing what environmental background levels exist. Because if I go out and collect samples, I have to ask myself, if I'm assessing exposure from a given source, I need to know that the exposure I'm estimating is the exposure from that specific source. If I'm looking at a chemical compound that's ubiquitous in the environment, it may be very hard for me to parse out how much of that actually came from the pollution source and how much of that actually was pre-existing in the environment already. So here are some examples. On the Toms River Pediatric Cancer Study, we had collected some water samples, and some of those samples were analyzed for gross alpha emissions, radioactivity in the water. Low levels were measured, as is typical, because we have background levels of radiation throughout our entire environment. But an astute analytic chemist noticed that when they collected samples from Monday through Thursday and analyzed them same day, they seemed to have higher levels of alpha emissions in the samples than when they collected samples on Friday and analyzed them on Monday. That led to the recognition that there was some short-lived isotope, radium-224, that actually existed in these particular water samples. Turns out that the radium-224 is something that's naturally occurring in the geology of the environment in this particular area. Well, there was concern in this community about could we have radiation exposures from nuclear power plants that are located fairly close to the community or military sites that handle nuclear missiles that in the past had been located to this community. So that became the question. This alpha activity that we are observing in these water samples, is this related to these pollution sources, or is this something that just naturally occurs in the environment? It turned out in this particular case that it was norm or naturally occurring radioactive material was causing these higher alpha emissions in water samples initially. And that was important for us to know so that we could attribute exposures to the proper source. Another example of this could be arsenic in seafood. It's not uncommon to have background levels of arsenic in seafood or foods like mushrooms. It turns out that the arsenic that we typically measure in seafood or in plants like mushrooms are oftentimes large organic arsenicals that are not absorbed well by the body, and therefore they result in very little internal exposure to arsenic and tend, as a result, to not be particularly toxic. It's the inorganic arsenics that typically are the toxic forms of arsenic, And it's important for us to know what the background levels are, because if our samples are analyzed for only total arsenic, we won't know how much is the organic, non-toxic form versus the inorganic, more toxic forms of arsenic. So again, it becomes important for us to think about what are background levels so that we can properly attribute what we're measuring to the proper sources of those pollutants. There are many types of environmental samples. The scale of these environmental samples could be taken to represent everything from regional areas, such as EPA's Ambient Air Quality Monitoring Network, to the micro scale, individual personal exposures like that dry cleaner in that picture in one of the prior slides. For example, I could take personal samples where I might put a pump on someone and pull an air sample out of their breathing zone, so I can measure their personal micro level exposures. I might walk in an environment and take an area sample. I walk into an environment on a factory floor, and rather than putting samples on individual people, I put samples in the area where people are working, and I collect an air sample there, which would be representative of kind of the exposures that everybody working on the floor may come in contact with. Or I might actually take samples which are actual specific source sampling. A good example of this would be if I had a smokestack and I collect an air sample out of the smokestack because I want to document and know what this facility is actually releasing to the environment. That would be an example of a source sample. I also may have other types of samples listed here on the slide. I might have a composite sample, which is oftentimes a term utilized when we're collecting water samples. I might walk over to a water treatment plant and every hour collect a little bucket of water and then put every bucket together in one sample and analyze that whole sample. I'm compositing the samples over time. I may have something oftentimes referred to as a real-time sampler, which is a device that I can bring out into the environment, and it'll give me essentially what the exposure concentration is or what the ambient level of a given chemical is at a specific point in time. I can do extractive versus non-destructive sampling. Extractive is the traditional example where I might have a sample media and I pull air through that media, and that media removes the pollutant out of the air. And then I can send that media off to a lab to be analyzed by analytic chemists. That is an example where I may extract the pollutant out of the environment and send it off for analysis. But I also have other types of techniques. For example, a technology that exists out there is using infrared light. And I can actually shine an infrared light across the top of a smokestack, for example, which would then measure through infrared spectrometry what the emissions are coming out of that smokestack. In that case, I'm actually analyzing the sample in real time, but I'm also not consuming the sample in the analysis. So that would be a non-destructive technique. So there are different advantages and disadvantages to all of these individual sampling strategies. The key thing is that it has to be designed to meet the purpose and the objectives of your sampling plan. One of the key parameters for us to talk about is sample locations. How do we determine where we actually collect our samples? This is going to vary depending on the purpose and the objectives of your exposure assessment and hence your sampling plan. In some cases, we might use something like a straight grid, as depicted here in this particular slide, where we have no pre-existing information on what the levels may be. And again, because I do a lot of air quality work, you'll notice that most of my examples are air quality related. Certainly, this would still be applicable to other media, whether it's soil or water sampling as well. But in this case, if I didn't have any pre-existing information and I simply needed to know what is the basic spatial characterization of air pollutants in this given area, one way to approach that would be to do what's oftentimes referred to as a straight grid. Basically, I take uniform distances and I just measure equally across the area to give me some basic spatial characterization of what the pollutant concentrations might be. This is oftentimes helpful when you don't have pre-existing information. This may also be helpful on your initial sampling campaign, where you're just trying to get some basic information to know how the pollutant is distributed in that area, and that may further guide different sampling approaches in the future. But a straight grid can be very useful for those preliminary evaluations. There are some other approaches that can be utilized as well. We can do population-based or census-based sampling locations. This may be an example where I'm really focused on determining risk. So I want to know what the exposures are like for the highest or largest number of people. I may say I have a limited public health budget Consequently, I want to focus and prioritize my efforts on protecting the largest number of people that I can. If that is the case, I may decide I'm going to collect my samples in areas that are more populated because I want to estimate what the exposures are for the largest number of people. Now, the limitation of that approach is I might not know what the exposures are to people that live in rural areas. So I might not have a good assessment of what those exposures may be. But again, this can be utilized when my overall goal is I want to protect the largest number of people I can with the limited resources that I have. So this is oftentimes referred to as a population or census-based type of sampling location selection. With that said, I think it's always good, regardless of what you do, I think it's always nice to have a background sample. As we've already talked about, it might be important to know what's existing in the background, because if I'm going to try and ascribe or attribute exposures to given pollution sources, I'm going to need to know what the background levels are in order for me to do that attribution. Sometimes we may actually do a specific facility-focused sampling exercise or campaign. In this case, this might be a regulatory compliance. Are you complying with your allowable emissions limits? The slide here actually shows a picture of a facility that had some serious exposures and employees who were getting sick. They were also violating all types of hazardous waste disposal regulations. So there was actually a criminal investigation that was done. And in this case, sampling was set up to actually focus on what the emissions are and releases are from this given facility. You'll see the red arrow points to the background sampling location. These other locations were downwind. We needed the background location to explicitly ascribe the exposures to this specific facility. And this was important in terms of the criminal investigation that was done for this facility. And unfortunately, I'm told that the owner of this facility actually had criminal charges pressed as a result of what they were doing. But this is an example of where we might specifically design our sampling plan to tell us specific information about a specific facility. I might also do sampling locations that may be driven primarily by health concerns or study-based concerns. This is an example of some modeling that we did in the Toms River Pediatric Cancer Study, where we were looking at Oyster Creek Nuclear Power Plant and modeling what the releases and exposures may have been in support of what the exposures could have been for the study subjects in that retrospective investigation. So that can also guide your sampling locations. But the key point here is your purpose and objectives are going to drive where you're going to sample, how you're going to set up your sampling, and that may vary as your purpose and objectives vary. So to summarize, sampling methods are often driven by the purpose and objectives of the assessment. Point of contact sampling requires the use of validated sampling and analytic methods. Data quality objectives must be clearly defined. And there are many different types of approaches that one can utilize to select the proper sampling locations. Certainly, thoughtfulness has to be given to where you sample, but this is going to be driven primarily by the purpose and objectives of your exposure assessment.